The last person Ethan Whitmore expected to change his life was a waitress carrying a secret that belonged to his mother. The music drifted through the grand ballroom like a memory no one could quite hold on to. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Glasses clinked softly. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. The annual Whitmore Foundation Winter Gala was the kind of event where powerful people gathered to celebrate success, make promises, and pretend they were not competing with one another. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of it all. At 38, he had become one of the most recognizable businessmen in New York. His company appeared on magazine covers. His speeches moved markets. His name opened doors across the country. Yet none of that seemed to matter tonight. He adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo and stared through the crowd with the familiar feeling that success had somehow made life quieter instead of fuller. Across the room, a waitress moved between tables carrying a silver tray. Most guests never noticed her. They rarely noticed anyone wearing a uniform. But Ethan did. Not because she was trying to attract attention. Quite the opposite. She carried herself with an unusual calm. While others rushed, she seemed completely at ease. Her movements were graceful, efficient, almost elegant. Claire Bennett smiled politely as she refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned back. Her uniform was simple. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged anywhere except the event staff. Yet there was something different in her eyes. Something thoughtful, observant, as if she saw more than she ever said. Near the stage, the band began playing a slow waltz. Couples gradually filled the dance floor. Laughter floated through the room. The atmosphere softened. Ethan glanced toward the musicians and then toward the crowd. For reasons he could not explain, his eyes returned to Claire. She had stopped beside a table near the windows, arranging folded napkins with careful attention. One of the board members approached Ethan and offered a joke about finding a dance partner. Ethan smiled politely, but his attention remained elsewhere. Before he could talk himself out of it, he crossed the room. Claire looked up when she noticed someone standing beside her. For a moment, she seemed surprised. "Good evening, sir," she said warmly. "Is there anything you need?" Ethan hesitated. It felt ridiculous, completely unlike him. Yet the words came anyway. "Would you care to dance?" Claire blinked. Around them, conversations seemed to fade into the background. A few nearby guests turned their heads. Ethan almost laughed at himself. He negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, but somehow asking a waitress to dance felt far more uncertain. Claire glanced toward the dance floor, then back at him. A small smile appeared. "I'm supposed to be working," she said. "Just one song," Ethan replied. After a brief pause, she nodded. He offered his hand. She accepted. Together they stepped onto the dance floor. The music carried them slowly beneath the chandelier light. Neither spoke at first. The room seemed strangely distant. Then, as Claire turned gracefully beneath his arm, something caught Ethan's eye. A silver necklace rested against her collarbone. Small, worn with age. Familiar. His heartbeat slowed. The world seemed to narrow around a single object. There, engraved on the back of the pendant, illuminated by a beam of golden light, was a name he had not seen in 25 years. Evelyn. The music continued, but Ethan barely heard it. His eyes remained fixed on the small silver pendant resting against Claire Bennett's collarbone. Evelyn. The name seemed impossible. Familiar. Painfully familiar. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it. The ballroom lights reflected across the polished floor as couples moved around them, yet everything beyond that necklace faded into the background. Claire noticed the change in his expression. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Ethan blinked. The question pulled him back to the present. "Your necklace," he said carefully. "Where did you get it?" Claire instinctively touched the pendant with her fingertips. A faint smile appeared on her face. Not the smile of someone showing off jewelry. The smile of someone remembering a person they loved. "I have had it for as long as I can remember," she said. "It belonged to my grandmother." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Your grandmother?" Claire nodded. "Well, technically she was not my biological grandmother. She raised me after my parents passed away when I was young. She was the kindest person I ever knew." The band reached the end of the song. Around them, applause drifted through the ballroom. Claire gently stepped back. "Thank you for the dance, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan stood motionless for a second before finding his voice. "Please, call me Ethan." Claire smiled politely. "Then thank you, Ethan." Before he could ask another question, one of the event coordinators hurried toward her carrying a stack of menus. Claire excused herself and returned to work. Within seconds, she disappeared into the crowd. Yet Ethan remained standing in the middle of the dance floor, staring at the place where she had been. Evelyn. His mother's name was not common. At least not common enough to appear on an old pendant identical to one he remembered from childhood. He had seen that necklace before. Not recently. Not even in the last decade. But as a boy, he remembered watching his mother wear it almost every day. The memory arrived unexpectedly. A bright summer afternoon. The smell of lemonade on a patio overlooking the Hudson River. His mother laughing as she lifted him into the air. The silver pendant catching sunlight as it rested against her dress. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 25 years. 25 years since Evelyn Whitmore vanished from his life. 25 years of unanswered questions. 25 years of hearing the same explanation. She left. She chose another life. She never came back. The story had been repeated so often that eventually everyone stopped questioning it. Everyone except Ethan. As he grew older, doubt had quietly settled into the corners of his mind. His mother had loved him. He remembered that much with complete certainty. The warmth in her voice. The bedtime stories. The handwritten notes she tucked into his school lunch. None of it matched the image of a woman who would willingly disappear without a word. Yet there had never been proof. Only silence. Deep, endless silence. Across the ballroom, Claire moved between tables carrying coffee cups and dessert plates. She looked ordinary, invisible to most of the guests. But Ethan could not stop watching her. Something about her felt connected to a chapter of his life that had never truly ended. Near midnight, as guests began leaving the gala, Ethan stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the city skyline. Cold December air greeted him. The lights of Manhattan stretched for miles beneath the dark sky. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph he had carried for years. The edges were worn. The image faded. A young woman stood smiling beside a little boy. Around her neck hung a silver pendant. Ethan stared at the photograph, then back through the ballroom windows toward Claire. The necklaces were identical. The photograph remained in Ethan's hand long after the last guests had left the ballroom. Snow drifted quietly beyond the terrace railings. The city lights shimmered below like distant stars. He had spent years trying to stop asking questions about his mother. Years convincing himself that some mysteries were meant to remain unanswered. Yet tonight, for the first time in decades, something felt different. Real. Tangible. Back inside, the staff worked efficiently to clear tables and fold linens. Claire moved among them carrying trays toward the service entrance. She was tired. Her shift had started before sunrise and stretched well beyond midnight. Even so, she carried herself with the same calm grace Ethan had noticed earlier. As she passed through a quiet hallway behind the ballroom, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning around, she found Ethan standing a few feet away. Without the crowd, without the music, he looked different. Less like a billionaire. More like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. "I hope I am not keeping you," he said. Claire offered a polite smile. "It has been a long night, but I am almost finished." Ethan glanced toward the pendant resting against her uniform. "Would you tell me more about your grandmother?" The question surprised her. Most people noticed the necklace. Few ever asked about the woman behind it. Claire hesitated before nodding. Her name was Rose Bennett. Ethan listened carefully. "She raised me in a small town about 70 miles north of the city. She owned a little bookstore near Main Street." Claire's eyes softened as she spoke. "Everyone loved her." "And the necklace?" Ethan asked. Claire touched the pendant again. "She gave it to me shortly before she passed away 3 years ago." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Did she ever tell you where it came from?" Claire looked thoughtful. "Not exactly. Whenever I asked, she would smile and say it belonged to someone who never stopped loving her family." The word struck Ethan with unexpected force. He stared at the floor for a moment. Someone who never stopped loving her family. It sounded strangely familiar, like something his mother might have said. Claire noticed the emotion crossing his face. "Why are you asking about this?" Ethan looked up. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he carefully removed the old photograph from his pocket and handed it to her. Claire studied the faded image. Her expression changed immediately. "That necklace," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "My mother wore it." Silence settled between them. Claire looked from the photograph to the pendant around her neck and back again. "That cannot be possible. I have spent 25 years hearing impossible explanations, Ethan said quietly. I am beginning to think impossible things happen more often than people realize. Claire stared at the image again. The young woman in the photograph looked kind, warm, familiar somehow. Not because Claire recognized her face, but because something about the smile reminded her of stories Rose used to tell. Stories about friendship, loyalty, regret. A memory surfaced suddenly. A rainy afternoon inside the bookstore. Rose sitting beside the window with a cardboard box on her lap. A box she never allowed anyone to open. Claire had been 12 years old. Curious. She remembered asking what was inside. Rose had smiled sadly and said, "Some promises take a lifetime to keep." Standing in the empty hallway years later, Claire felt a chill she could not explain. For the first time, she began to wonder whether the answers Ethan sought had been sitting quietly in that forgotten box all along. Claire barely slept that night. The image of the photograph remained in her mind long after she returned to her small apartment in Queens. Outside her window, snow rested quietly on parked cars and empty sidewalks. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. She placed her keys on the kitchen counter and stared at the necklace resting in her palm. For years it had simply been part of her life. A gift from the woman who raised her. A keepsake. A memory. Nothing more. Now it felt different. Like a clue she had never known existed. Early the next morning, Claire stood in front of an old cedar chest tucked into the corner of her bedroom. Rose Bennett had left it to her years ago. Inside were photographs, greeting cards, newspaper clippings, and dozens of small items collected over a lifetime. Claire knelt beside it and slowly lifted the lid. The scent of old paper drifted into the room. She carefully sorted through the contents. Family recipes, birthday cards, faded photographs from vacations. Then, near the bottom, she found something she had not seen in years. A small brass key attached to a tag written in Rose's handwriting. Claire's heart skipped. She immediately recognized it. The key belonged to the locked cardboard box Rose had always kept hidden in the bookstore office. The box Claire had never been allowed to open. Across Manhattan, Ethan sat in his office on the top floor of Whitmore Tower. The city stretched beyond the glass walls, but his attention remained fixed on the photograph lying on his desk. His assistant had already canceled 3 meetings. He rarely allowed personal matters to interfere with business. Today was different. 25 years of questions had suddenly become impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed. It was Claire. Ethan answered immediately. "I found something," she said. Less than 2 hours later, they met outside the old bookstore in the small Hudson Valley town where Claire had grown up. The building stood quietly on a corner beneath a faded sign that still read Bennett Books. Snow covered the sidewalk. The display windows were dark. Claire unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of winter sunlight. Shelves lined the walls exactly as they had years ago. Everything felt frozen in time. Ethan followed silently. He could sense the memories surrounding the place. Claire led him through the bookstore and into a small office in the back. There, beneath an old desk, sat a cardboard box secured with a brass lock. Neither spoke for several seconds. Claire removed the key from her coat pocket. Her hand trembled slightly. "This is the box she never wanted anyone to open," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. The room seemed strangely still. Even the old wall clock sounded louder than usual. Claire inserted the key. The lock clicked. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly organized envelopes tied together with blue ribbon. Some were yellowed with age. Others appeared untouched. Ethan picked up the top envelope and froze. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were 5 words. "To my son, Ethan Whitmore." The room fell silent. Claire looked at him. Ethan stared at the envelope as though it had traveled across time itself. 25 years. 25 years of silence. Yet resting inside that forgotten box were letters addressed directly to him. Letters that had never arrived. Neither of them moved. The envelopes sat inside the box like forgotten voices waiting to be heard. Ethan carefully picked up the first letter. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers. The postmark showed a date from 24 years earlier. His throat tightened. Claire stood quietly beside him, sensing that this moment belonged to him as much as it belonged to the past. Ethan slowly unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably elegant. Warm. Familiar. He had not seen it since childhood, yet he recognized it instantly. "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then somehow life has given us a second chance. I want you to know something before anything else. I never stopped loving you." Ethan closed his eyes. The words hit harder than he expected. For years he had prepared himself for every possible explanation except this one. Across countless sleepless nights, he had imagined anger, regret, even indifference. But not love. Never this simple, painful declaration of love. He continued reading. Evelyn wrote about missing birthdays, missing school plays, missing holidays. She described watching snow fall through a small apartment window while wondering whether her son was warm, happy, and safe. Every sentence carried the same message. She had not forgotten him. She had thought about him every day. Claire watched Ethan silently. The confident businessman she had met only days earlier seemed to disappear. In his place stood a little boy finally hearing the words he had waited decades to hear. As Ethan carefully returned the letter to the envelope, he noticed something unusual. There were dozens more. Some addressed to him, others addressed to no one at all. Claire reached into the box and lifted a small leather journal resting beneath the stack. A ribbon marked several pages near the center. She opened it gently. Tucked inside was a photograph. Rose Bennett stood beside a smiling woman Ethan recognized immediately. Evelyn, younger than he remembered, yet unmistakably his mother. The two women stood in front of the bookstore, their arms around each other like lifelong friends. Claire stared at the image. Rose knew her, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. Not just knew her. She trusted her. They searched deeper through the contents of the box. Receipts, notes, old photographs. Then Claire found a folded document hidden inside a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front were 3 words written in Rose's handwriting. "Keep this safe." Claire carefully opened it. Ethan leaned closer. The document was a property lease from 25 years ago. Attached was a forwarding address in Connecticut. Beneath it sat a handwritten note from Evelyn. "If anything ever happens, please keep these records. One day Ethan deserves the truth." The room became very quiet. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the bookstore windows. Ethan looked at the address again. His heart began to race. It was the first real location connected to his mother that he had ever seen. Not a rumor, not a family story, not a fading memory. A real place, a real lead. Claire met his gaze. Neither needed to say what they were both thinking. Somewhere behind the letters, the photographs, and the years of silence, there was still a larger story waiting to be uncovered. The drive to Connecticut took just under 3 hours, but to Ethan it felt like traveling through 25 years of unanswered questions. Gray winter clouds hung low above the highway. Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat, holding the leather journal on her lap. Neither spoke much. Every few miles, Ethan glanced at the folded address resting beside the steering wheel. He had memorized it already, yet he kept checking as if afraid it might disappear. By early afternoon, they turned onto a narrow road lined with bare maple trees. At the end stood a modest white house overlooking a frozen pond. It was smaller than Ethan expected. Simpler. The kind of place no one would ever associate with the Whitmore family name. For several moments they remained in the car. The house seemed untouched by time. A wind chime moved gently near the porch. Smoke drifted from a nearby chimney. Someone still lived there. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Claire looked toward him. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Ethan stared at the front door. "I do not know." They stepped out into the cold. Snow crunched beneath their shoes as they walked toward the porch. Ethan knocked once, then twice. A few seconds later the door opened. An elderly woman appeared. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Her blue eyes moved carefully between them. For a brief moment she said nothing. Then her gaze settled on Ethan's face. The color drained from her expression. "My goodness," she whispered. Ethan felt a strange sensation. Recognition. Not from him. From her. "Did you know my mother?" he asked. The woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they glistened with emotion. "You look exactly like her." Silence filled the porch. Claire exchanged a glance with Ethan. The woman stepped aside and invited them inside. The living room was warm and filled with books, framed photographs, and old furniture polished by years of care. Everything felt lived in, loved. Above the fireplace hung a photograph that immediately caught Ethan's attention. His breath stopped. There stood Evelyn Whitmore beside Rose Bennett. Both smiling, both younger, both holding cups of coffee while standing in front of the bookstore. Ethan slowly approached the picture. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman folded her hands together. My name is Margaret Ellis. Evelyn was my closest friend. Ethan stared at her. Then you know what happened. Margaret's eyes lowered. For several seconds, she remained silent. Then she walked toward a small cabinet near the fireplace and removed a wooden box. Unlike the one from the bookstore, this box appeared well cared for. Protected. Important. She placed it on the coffee table between them. I have been waiting many years for this conversation, she said quietly. Claire felt a chill run through her. Margaret opened the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, letters, and a stack of cassette tapes labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. Ethan stared at them in disbelief. His mother had left behind far more than memories. She had left a record, a trail, a voice waiting to be heard. Then Margaret looked directly at him and spoke the words that changed everything. Ethan, your mother never abandoned you. She spent the rest of her life trying to find a way back to you. The room remained silent after Margaret's words. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow, graceful patterns. Inside, Ethan felt as though the foundation of his entire life had shifted. For 25 years, he had carried a single belief. His mother had chosen to leave. Every difficult birthday, every empty holiday, every unanswered question had been built upon that assumption. Now, sitting across from a woman who had known Evelyn better than almost anyone, he was hearing a completely different story. Margaret carefully removed one of the cassette tapes from the wooden box. A small label was attached to the front. Ethan, age 18. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment. She made dozens of these, Margaret said softly. One for nearly every major milestone she thought she might miss. Ethan stared at the tape. His chest tightened. Claire watched quietly beside him. Even she was struggling to absorb what they were discovering. Margaret walked to a bookshelf and retrieved an old cassette player. The machine looked decades old, yet it still worked. She inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room for a second. Then a woman's voice emerged. Warm, gentle, familiar. Ethan froze. He had not heard his mother's voice since he was a child. Hello, Ethan, Evelyn said. If you are listening to this, then you are 18 years old now. I wish I could see the man you have become. Ethan lowered his eyes. The room disappeared around him. For the next several minutes, Evelyn spoke as though no years had passed. She talked about the books he loved as a boy, the way he used to ask endless questions at bedtime, the dreams she hoped he would chase one day. Claire noticed tears gathering in Ethan's eyes, though he never looked away from the cassette player. Then the tone of the recording changed. Evelyn's voice grew quieter, more careful. There are people who believe keeping us apart protects something important, she said. I pray that one day the truth finds its way to you. Ethan looked up immediately. Margaret closed her eyes. She had heard the recording many times before, yet the words still carried weight. The tape continued. If you ever meet Rose Bennett, trust her. She knows more than she can safely say. And if you are hearing this, it means she kept her promise. Claire felt a chill. Rose. Her grandmother. The woman who had raised her. Suddenly pieces that never seemed connected began falling into place. Margaret reached into the box again and removed a photograph. It showed Rose and Evelyn standing beside a much younger Claire. She could not have been older than 4 years old. Claire stared at it in confusion. I do not remember this. Margaret smiled sadly. You were very young. Claire examined the picture more closely. Then something caught her attention. In the background stood another person. A tall man partially hidden near a parked car. His face was blurry, but Margaret recognized him immediately. Her expression changed. Ethan noticed. What is it? He asked. Margaret hesitated. For the first time that day, she seemed uncertain. Then she slowly pointed toward the figure in the photograph. That man visited Evelyn several times before everything changed, she said quietly. And he happened to be your uncle, Richard Whitmore. Richard Whitmore. The name settled over the room like a shadow from the past. Ethan stared at the photograph again, this time focusing on the blurry figure in the background. His uncle had always been a respected part of the family. Calm, polished, reliable. After Evelyn disappeared, Richard had helped manage family affairs and often stepped in during difficult moments. Ethan had trusted him for most of his life. Yet now, seeing him standing near Evelyn in a photograph nobody was supposed to have, that trust suddenly felt uncertain. Margaret slowly lowered herself into an armchair. The years seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. I never wanted to believe it, she said quietly. For a long time, I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Ethan sat forward. What exactly are you saying? Margaret folded her hands together. I am saying that Richard visited Evelyn several times during the months before she vanished from your life. Every visit left her frightened and worried. She never explained everything to me. She only said there were powerful people trying to control decisions that should never have belonged to them. Claire listened carefully. Every answer seemed to uncover 3 more questions. Margaret reached into the wooden box once more and removed a small envelope. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. Across the front, Evelyn had written a single instruction. Open only if necessary. Margaret handed it to Ethan. I promised her I would never open it unless the truth needed defending. Ethan stared at the envelope for several seconds. Then he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a small brass key. The paper contained only a few handwritten lines. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. The records are hidden where the music never stopped. Rose knows the place. Trust Claire. Ethan read the note twice. Then a third time. The music never stopped, he repeated. Claire suddenly looked up. The music box. Margaret nodded immediately. Of course. Claire remembered it at once. In the bookstore office, there had always been an antique music box sitting on a shelf behind Rose's desk. Even after it stopped working properly, Rose refused to throw it away. As a child, Claire had asked why it mattered so much. Rose simply smiled and said some memories deserved a safe place to rest. Ethan felt a surge of cautious hope. Another clue. Another piece of a puzzle that had remained hidden for decades. Margaret looked toward the falling snow outside the window. There is something else you should know. Ethan and Claire turned toward her. Margaret's expression softened. During the final years of her life, Evelyn never talked about money. She never talked about inheritance. She only talked about you. Ethan lowered his eyes. Every Christmas, Margaret continued, she bought a gift she could never send. Every birthday, she wrote another letter. Every year, she believed she would find a way back. Silence filled the room once again. Outside, winter winds moved across the frozen pond. Inside, Ethan stared at the small brass key resting in his palm. Somewhere inside an old music box waiting back in the bookstore, another piece of his mother's story had been hidden all along. The sun was already setting by the time Ethan and Claire returned to the bookstore. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered street. The town looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. Yet inside the old building, both of them carried a growing sense that they were standing at the edge of a truth that had been hidden for decades. Claire moved quickly toward the office at the back. The antique music box still sat on the shelf exactly where Rose had left it. Dust covered its polished wooden surface. For years it had been nothing more than a decoration from another era. Now it felt like something entirely different. Ethan carefully placed the brass key on the desk. Neither spoke. The silence felt important. Claire lifted the music box and turned it over. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed a small keyhole hidden beneath a felt panel on the bottom. Her breath caught. Ethan. He stepped closer. The brass key slid into the lock perfectly. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan slowly turned it. A soft click echoed through the room. The bottom compartment opened. Inside rested a sealed leather folder wrapped in blue ribbon. Claire stared at it. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it from the hidden compartment. The folder felt heavier than it looked. Years of secrets often did. He carefully untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside were financial records, handwritten notes, legal documents, and several letters bearing the Whitmore family name. Claire picked up one of the documents and immediately noticed a date. 25 years earlier. The same year, Evelyn disappeared. Ethan began reading. His expression slowly changed. Confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper. One document outlined a proposed restructuring of the Whitmore family trust. Another detailed voting control within the family company. Richard Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly. Claire looked over Ethan's shoulder. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. If Evelyn and her son had remained together, certain assets would eventually have passed through Ethan under his mother's authority. If Evelyn was removed from the equation, the balance of influence inside the family shifted dramatically. Ethan lowered the papers. This cannot be real. Claire said nothing. The evidence sat directly in front of them. Page after page. Signature after signature. Then Ethan found one final envelope hidden at the bottom of the folder. The handwriting on the front belonged to Evelyn. His hands froze. The letter had never been mailed. It was addressed to Richard. Ethan carefully unfolded it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn wrote that she knew what was happening. She knew pressure was being placed on her from multiple directions. She knew efforts were being made to isolate her from her son. Most importantly, she wrote that she would never willingly leave Ethan behind. Claire watched Ethan read the final lines. Tears filled his eyes. "If anyone ever tells my son that I abandoned him," Evelyn had written, "they are not protecting him. They are protecting themselves." Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the bookstore windows. Inside, the truth had finally begun to take shape. For the first time in 25 years, the story he had been told no longer matched the evidence resting in his hands. That night, neither Ethan nor Claire left the bookstore until long after midnight. The documents remained spread across Rose Bennett's old desk beneath the glow of a single lamp. Outside, fresh snow covered the empty streets. Inside, decades of assumptions continued to unravel one page at a time. Ethan sat silently, reading the same letter again and again. Every sentence written by his mother felt like a conversation stolen by time. Claire carefully organized the documents into categories: financial records, personal correspondence, legal agreements. Most of them pointed toward the same conclusion. Evelyn had never intended to disappear from her son's life. She had been trying to preserve a path back to him. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, Claire discovered something unusual tucked between several pages of accounting records. It was a receipt from a storage facility located outside Hartford, Connecticut. The date matched the final year of Evelyn's life. Attached to it was a handwritten note. "In case anything happens, the journal stays there." Claire immediately handed it to Ethan. He studied the receipt carefully. "A journal," he said quietly. "Not the one we already found." Claire shook her head. "This appears to be something different." Ethan looked toward the stack of letters. Every major discovery so far had revealed another layer beneath it. Perhaps the journal contained the final piece. By sunrise, they were already back on the road. The storage facility sat beside a quiet industrial park surrounded by bare winter trees. Nothing about the place seemed remarkable. Yet Ethan felt the same nervous anticipation he had experienced outside Margaret Ellis's house. The manager was an elderly man who had worked there for decades. When Ethan presented the receipt, the man's expression changed. "I remember her," he said after a moment. "Very kind woman. Paid years in advance." Ethan's heart skipped. "Do you still have the unit?" The man nodded. 20 minutes later, they stood inside a narrow storage space no larger than a walk-in closet. Most of it was empty. A single wooden trunk rested against the far wall. Dust covered the lid. Claire exchanged a glance with Ethan. Together they opened it. Inside were notebooks, photographs, newspaper clippings, and one thick leather-bound journal wrapped carefully in cloth. Ethan lifted it gently. His mother's initials were embossed on the cover. For several seconds, he simply held it. Then he opened the first page. The journal contained years of entries. Some joyful, some heartbreaking. But one passage immediately caught his attention. It had been marked with a ribbon. Ethan turned to the page. His mother's handwriting remained steady and clear. "Richard visited again today. He says the family company cannot survive uncertainty. He says Ethan is better off believing I chose to leave. He says time will make everything easier. He is wrong." Ethan stopped reading. The words felt like a thunderclap in an otherwise silent room. Claire slowly sat down on the edge of the trunk. Neither spoke. They no longer had fragments of a story. They had direct testimony from Evelyn herself. As Ethan continued turning pages, another folded paper slipped from the journal and landed softly on the floor. He picked it up. It was a recent document compared to everything else, dated only 3 years before Evelyn's death. At the bottom appeared the name of a law firm in Manhattan, and beside it, a scheduled meeting that had never happened. The client listed on the document was Ethan Whitmore. The address of the Manhattan law firm stayed in Ethan's mind throughout the entire drive back to the city. By the following morning, he and Claire were standing inside a quiet office overlooking Bryant Park. The firm had changed ownership years earlier, but many of its records had been preserved. An archivist led them into a conference room and placed several storage boxes on the table. "These are all we could find," she said. Ethan thanked her and immediately began searching through the files. Most contained routine paperwork, contracts, correspondence, administrative notes. Then Claire discovered a thin folder labeled with a date from 3 years before Evelyn's death. Inside was a scheduled appointment request submitted under Evelyn Whitmore's name. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. His mother had tried to arrange a legal meeting, not to discuss money, not to discuss inheritance. The purpose section contained only one sentence. Establish contact with my son. Ethan closed his eyes. The simplicity of those words somehow hurt more than everything else. She had not been trying to gain something. She had simply been trying to find him. Claire continued turning pages. Attached to the request was a memo written by one of the attorneys. The meeting had never occurred because the client canceled unexpectedly 2 days before the appointment. Yet another note followed. A phone call had been received from a representative claiming to speak on Evelyn's behalf. The attorney handling the case had found the situation unusual and documented everything. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Who made the call? The answer appeared on the final page. Richard Whitmore. Silence settled over the conference room. The evidence now stretched across decades. Letters, journals, financial records, witnesses, legal documents. Every road seemed to lead to the same place. Claire slowly looked up. He knew. Ethan nodded. For the first time, he was no longer questioning whether the truth existed. He was only questioning how much of it had been hidden. That evening, Ethan requested a private meeting at Whitmore Tower. Richard arrived precisely on time. Calm, confident, impeccably dressed as always. The city skyline glowed behind the office windows. Ethan stood near the conference table. Claire sat quietly nearby with several folders arranged in front of her. Richard smiled politely. You sounded serious. Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then he placed Evelyn's letter on the table. The smile disappeared. Richard recognized the handwriting immediately. Neither man spoke. Claire watched as years of carefully maintained appearances seemed to crack beneath a single sheet of paper. Ethan slid forward another document. Then another. The journal entries. The legal records. The appointment request. Richard's expression grew increasingly pale. Finally, Ethan asked the question he had carried for 25 years. Why did my mother spend her life trying to reach me while I spent mine believing she left? Richard lowered his eyes. The room became very still. Outside, snow began falling across Manhattan once again. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard exhaled slowly and whispered the words Ethan never expected to hear. Because I believed I was protecting the family. And I was wrong. Richard remained seated as silence filled the conference room. The confidence he had carried into Whitmore Tower was gone. Snow drifted beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows while the lights of Manhattan shimmered below. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the man he had trusted for most of his life. Richard slowly folded his hands together. He looked older than he had only an hour earlier. I told myself it was temporary, he said quietly. I believed enough time would pass and everyone would heal. I convinced myself that protecting the company meant protecting the family. Ethan listened without interruption. For years he had imagined this moment. Anger, confrontation, accusations. Yet what he felt now was something different. Sadness. The kind that arrived when a painful truth finally stopped hiding. Richard looked down at Evelyn's letter resting on the table. Your mother wanted to challenge decisions that would have changed the future of the company. She believed family mattered more than control. I believed control was the only thing keeping everything together. Claire remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold. Richard continued. The more determined she became, the more people around her treated her as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. I did not stop it. In many ways, I helped it happen. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every letter, every journal entry, every missed birthday suddenly felt real in a way they never had before. Richard reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. I brought this years ago and never found the courage to give it to you. Ethan accepted it carefully. Inside was a final document signed by Richard himself. It acknowledged the decisions that had separated Evelyn from meaningful contact with her son and detailed the efforts made to discourage communication over the years. Richard had documented everything, not for legal reasons, for his conscience. Ethan read the final page and placed it beside the other evidence. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Richard stood. I cannot change what happened, he said softly, but I can stop hiding from it. The following week, Ethan organized a private gathering attended by family members, longtime associates, and people who had known Evelyn. Instead of protecting old stories, he presented the truth. The letters, the journals, the recordings, the photographs. Piece by piece, the real story emerged. No dramatic speeches were necessary. Evelyn's own words spoke more powerfully than anyone else could. By the end of the evening, the room sat in complete silence. Not because people were shocked, because they finally understood. A woman who had been remembered as someone who walked away was revealed as someone who had spent her life trying to come back. As guests quietly departed, Ethan remained standing near a display of photographs. Claire joined him. Together they looked at an image of Evelyn smiling beside Rose Bennett outside the bookstore. "She never gave up," Claire said softly. Ethan nodded. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "No," he replied. "She never did." For the first time in 25 years, the weight he had carried since childhood began to feel lighter. 1 year later, spring sunlight filled the small garden built beside the restored Bennett bookstore. Cherry blossoms moved gently in the breeze. Fresh flowers surrounded a simple stone memorial dedicated to Evelyn Whitmore and Rose Bennett. No grand statues, no extravagant displays, just 2 names and a single inscription. Love always finds its way home. Ethan stood quietly near the garden entrance. For the first time in many years, there was peace in his expression. The investigation had ended months earlier. The truth had been acknowledged. Family records had been corrected. Evelyn's letters, journals, and recordings had been preserved so future generations would know her story. Not as a woman who walked away, but as a mother who never stopped trying to return. Nearby, Claire arranged cups of coffee on a small wooden table for visitors attending the memorial gathering. The bookstore had reopened as a community space exactly as Rose would have wanted. Children sat reading by the windows. Neighbors shared stories. Travelers stopped in for coffee and conversation. Life continued. Quietly. Beautifully. Ethan walked toward the memorial and placed one final photograph beneath the flowers. It was his favorite. Evelyn smiling beside Rose outside the bookstore many years ago. Neither woman looked wealthy. Neither looked powerful. Yet both had changed the course of countless lives through loyalty, kindness, and courage. Claire joined him a moment later. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, honest, the kind of silence that no longer carried unanswered questions. Ethan looked toward the bookstore. "You know," he said softly, "none of this would have happened if you had not agreed to one dance." Claire smiled. "I almost said no." Ethan laughed quietly. "I am very glad you did not." The church bell down the street rang once. People continued arriving at the garden. Some carried flowers. Others carried books. A few simply came to sit and reflect. Ethan looked at the memorial one last time. For years he had searched for someone to blame. For years he believed closure would come from anger. Instead, it arrived through truth, through forgiveness, through the discovery that love had been present all along, even when he could not see it. Claire touched the silver necklace resting against her collarbone. The same necklace that had started everything. It no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a bridge connecting lives that were always meant to find one another. As the afternoon sunlight warmed the garden, Ethan finally understood something his mother had been trying to teach him through every letter she wrote. The strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who keep loving when nobody is watching. The ones who keep hoping when hope seems unreasonable. The ones who protect truth until the day it is finally ready to be seen. And perhaps that is why some stories stay with us long after they end. Because they remind us that dignity does not need an audience. Kindness is never wasted. And the people we think we have lost may still be leaving traces of love behind them. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe quiet acts of courage deserve to be remembered, we would be honored if you joined us again for another story.